Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Willow Ridge was a town that carried its silence like an heirloom, passing it from one street to another with hushed winds and unmoved trees. The houses were close enough to hear each other's secrets, yet far enough to pretend they didn't. It was in this quiet, almost sleepy town that Eleanor Bailey lived, tucked away in a modest cream-painted bungalow with faded blue shutters and a mailbox that hadn't been replaced since the 90s. People in Willow Ridge knew Eleanor. They greeted her kindly, some with genuine warmth, others with the kind of pity that clung to her like perfume she never asked for. She was known as the loyal wife of Nathan Bailey, the respected accountant who always had his tie straight, handshake firm, and charm at the ready. What they didn't know, or perhaps chose not to know, was that behind the neat exterior of their home, Eleanor lived in a space that felt less like a house and more like a cage without visible bars. She would wake up each day before the birds started chirping and prepare breakfast like a ritual passed down through some ancient script, not because she was expected to, but because doing something predictable gave her a sense of rhythm in a life that otherwise felt unanchored. Her slippers made the same soft sound on the wooden floor, the kettle always let out the same tired whistle, and the eggs were always turned twice in the same blackened pan. But as much as she clung to these repetitive gestures, they could not drown out the reality of her growing loneliness. The newspapers she picked up each morning from the porch offered more meaningful engagement than her husband. The weatherman with his exaggerated smile offered more emotion than the man she shared a bed with. Nathan wasn't cruel in the ways people understand cruelty. He didn't hit her, didn't shout, didn't break things. But sometimes silence is its own kind of violence, slow, untraceable, and suffocating. There were days she would walk past him in the hallway, and he wouldn't even turn his head. Days when she would speak and receive no acknowledgement, as though she were a ghost in her own life. And what made it worse was that she kept trying to please, to impress, to connect. But it was like pouring water into a well with no bottom. Even when she smiled at him, her lips would tremble, not from nerves, but from the weight of so many unanswered gestures. Eleanor was slowly becoming a shell of who she had once been, and no one, not even she, seemed to notice it. Nathan had mastered the art of appearing kind. He smiled generously in public, opened doors for elderly women at the grocery store, and nodded with sincere eyes at town hall meetings. He would help load groceries for neighbors, speak warmly about his wife's delicious meals, and even donate to local charities, ensuring his name stayed golden in the town's eyes. But once the front door of their home closed behind them, he wore silence like armor. Eleanor had spent the better part of 17 years speaking into that silence, filling the void with tender suggestions, warm meals, and hesitant questions that never received answers. Her voice had grown smaller over time, not in volume but in conviction. She often found herself wondering when exactly she had stopped being seen, not just by Nathan but by herself. The days rolled into each other like waves on a shore that never fought back. She still laid out his clothes every morning, still made his favorite tea at exactly 7:15 p.m., still kept her emotions folded and placed neatly between the pages of her diary like pressed flowers, beautiful, lifeless, preserved. And it wasn't just the emotional distance that gnawed at her. It was the gaslighting, the subtle way Nathan made her question her memory, her intuition, her worth. He would change the location of important documents and then accuse her of being forgetful. He would deny saying things he clearly said, leaving her confused and second-guessing herself. It got to a point where Eleanor began writing down conversations in her journal, just to assure herself she hadn't imagined them. But she never showed him the journal. That was her only sanctuary, the one place he couldn't twist or erase. In the journal she was still real. She was still whole. Meanwhile, Nathan's charm only deepened in public. He was the man people admired, the man who mentored young accountants and advised local leaders. No one ever questioned why Eleanor seemed quieter each year, why her eyes looked a little duller, why she always stood a step behind him like a forgotten accessory. She had learned how to shrink herself, how to smile without showing too much emotion, how to speak in tones that wouldn't offend or provoke. It became a survival skill. She knew exactly which topics would irritate Nathan and avoided them like landmines. She cooked without being asked, cleaned without thanks, and pretended not to notice the text messages that came in at odd hours on his phone. Sometimes she wondered what would happen if she simply stopped trying. But then what? The silence would just grow heavier, and she wasn't sure if she could carry more of it. So she continued, not because she believed it would get better, but because she didn't yet know how to walk away. It wasn't always like this. In the beginning, there was laughter or something close to it. Nathan had once brought her lilies in a paper bag because all the florists were closed, and they had danced barefoot in their living room with the smell of fried plantains in the air. Back then, his smile reached his eyes, and he'd laugh at her bad jokes like they were the best he ever heard. He would call her from work just to say he missed her, and they'd spend weekends trying out recipes they found in random magazines. Those moments were real. They weren't perfect, but they were enough. Until they weren't. Somewhere between his promotions and the shifting seasons, he began to change. The smiles became transactional, the conversations reduced to logistics. Eleanor watched as the man who used to hold her hand at the market now walked ahead of her like she was his shadow. Conversations became transactional. He would inform her of dinner invitations, not ask. He would take trips without telling her, returning with barely a word about where he had been. And when she dared to ask, he'd look at her like she had committed the sin of needing connection. Her voice, once met with affection, now echoed in the space between them like an unwanted sound. And still she stayed, not because she was weak, but because she had invested too much of herself into a dream she was afraid to admit had died. Each year she told herself it was just a phase, that things would circle back. But time kept moving forward and Nathan kept moving further away. Eleanor's heart didn't break all at once. It cracked quiet like ice melting on a slow flame. And still she smiled at him, hoping to catch a flicker of the man she once knew. Hoping, even if it was foolish, that he'd notice her again. Eleanor found her solace in small things. The sound of birds nesting on their rooftop, the way sunlight hit the kitchen tiles at dawn, the scent of fresh laundry. She clung to those pockets of warmth because everything else felt cold. Yet she never complained. Not to the neighbors, not to her old college friends who called less frequently each year, not even to herself in the mirror. She had convinced herself that enduring was a kind of virtue, that holding on in silence was love. But inside her, a slow shift had begun, an invisible tremor buried deep beneath years of forced smiles and reluctant acceptance. She began writing more, journaling not just daily activities but feelings she'd never voiced. She began noticing things, how Nathan always flinched when she entered the room unexpectedly, how he cleared his browser history even though she never touched his laptop, how his shirt smelled of perfume she didn't own. She didn't ask, not yet, but the silence inside her was no longer empty. It was becoming sharp, deliberate, and watchful. And that silence would one day speak back. She began listening more, really listening, not just to Nathan, but to herself, to the part of her that had been buried under years of compromise and suppression. She realized that her tears weren't signs of weakness, they were warnings. Warnings that her spirit was still alive, still kicking against the walls of her invisible prison. The turning point wasn't a loud moment, but a quiet one. A Tuesday morning when she looked at herself in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. That day, she put on her lipstick not for Nathan, not for the town, but for herself. And when Nathan returned that evening, she didn't greet him at the door like she used to. She stayed in the kitchen, let him walk in and find her already seated. She was reclaiming her space, one small gesture at a time. She didn't know yet what she was building, but she knew it started with refusing to disappear. Nathan's world had always been centered around control, subtle, careful, never too overt to attract suspicion. It was the kind of control that smiled in public and suffocated in private. His ability to maintain an unblemished image was almost admirable in its precision. He knew exactly how to dress when to compliment a colleague, how to drop generous donations during church fundraisers, and how to make Eleanor feel like her questions were intrusions instead of concerns. To the residents of Willow Ridge, he was a model citizen, dependable, articulate, successful. But behind closed doors, Nathan had grown increasingly methodical, not just in his coldness but in his schemes. He was no longer simply ignoring Eleanor, he was actively orchestrating her erasure. He started small. A missing envelope here, a changed password there. When Eleanor would ask why her credit card statement hadn't arrived, he'd say she misplaced it. When she noticed a new line of credit she hadn't opened, he'd chuckle and tell her she probably forgot applying for it. And every time she looked uncertain or confused, he leaned into it, feeding the idea that maybe her memory wasn't what it used to be. To outsiders, he framed her as fragile, delicately so. He would mention in conversations how worried he was about Eleanor's well-being, how she had become withdrawn, how she often forgot things. He spun his web in whispers, threading seeds of doubt into the minds of those they both knew. Sabrina entered the picture like a summer breeze, light, effortless, unaware of the storm she was walking into. She was younger than Eleanor by nearly a decade, with a voice like silk and a laugh that Nathan found flattering. She had recently moved to Willow Ridge to manage a new property firm and met Nathan during a consultation he booked under the guise of a potential investment. What began as a business lunch became a series of late evening meetings and then unspoken weekends away. Nathan found in Sabrina the admiration he felt he deserved, the kind of attention he no longer received at home. And Sabrina, charmed by his eloquence and maturity, had no idea she was falling into a carefully curated narrative. He told her his wife had grown emotionally unstable, that she had stopped supporting him, that he stayed in the marriage only out of duty. Sabrina, naive to his manipulation, sympathized with him and accepted his affection without question. Nathan began making plans that involved removing Eleanor, not just emotionally but legally. With Sabrina's help, he drafted a fake investment proposal under her firm's letterhead, persuading Eleanor to sign it as a formality to secure joint assets. He told her it was to protect them both, especially as market prices fluctuated, and Eleanor, holding on to the last shreds of trust she had for the man she once loved, signed without resistance. What she didn't know was that she was signing away ownership of the house. Nathan's manipulation didn't end at paperwork. He slowly withdrew access to their joint accounts, began making large transfers to newly opened private funds, and claimed it was for tax purposes. He purchased a second phone Eleanor never saw and used it to coordinate with Sabrina and a legal advisor who helped him forge further documents. His goal was not just separation, it was exile. He wanted Eleanor out without causing a scandal, and the only way to achieve that was to make her appear unwell, incapable. He rehearsed conversations in his head, practiced tones of concern and regret, crafted lies so seamlessly that even he began to believe parts of them. Eleanor started noticing inconsistencies, her name removed from property documents, mail addressed to people she didn't recognize, and Nathan disappearing for days with vague explanations. When she asked questions, he became gentle but patronizing, the kind of tone one might use with a child who keeps misplacing toys. "You're overthinking again," he would say, brushing her hair from her face like she was the one unraveling. It was psychological warfare masked as affection. And Eleanor, though disoriented, was not blind. She began to watch him closely, no longer seeking affection but confirmation. She stopped reacting outwardly and instead retreated inward, gathering every thread of behavior, every conversation, and every unsigned document into her journal, as though she were documenting a crime in real time. While Nathan saw his plan moving forward flawlessly, Eleanor quietly began reclaiming clarity. She did not scream or confront. She did not weep openly or beg for answers. Instead, she booked an appointment with someone Nathan never imagined she'd reach out to, Maggie, her old university roommate turned legal consultant. Eleanor told her everything, not with dramatics but with careful details. She brought copies of suspicious documents, her journal screenshots of messages she'd quietly forwarded to herself. Maggie, stunned by the complexity and cruelty of the scheme, immediately began outlining the steps they would need to protect Eleanor. Together, they initiated a quiet investigation, hiring a private auditor to trace the financial transfers, documenting every suspicious signature, and filing discreet inquiries at the county records office. And through it all, Eleanor played her role at home flawlessly. She continued cooking Nathan's meals, greeting him with her usual calm, nodding at his lies, and letting him believe she was still under his spell. Nathan had built a performance, but he didn't know Eleanor had stepped behind the curtain. She was no longer the silent wife enduring in the shadows. She was waiting, watching, gathering power in silence. The same silence he used to suppress her was now the very weapon she would sharpen and aim back at him when the time was right. Eleanor rose early as she always did, but the air felt different on this particular morning. It was the kind of morning where nothing looked out of place, but everything felt misaligned, like a painting ever so slightly tilted on a wall. Nathan had already left, claiming a business breakfast downtown, though Eleanor knew he would not return until nightfall, and perhaps not even then. She stood in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of tea, not to soothe but to occupy. She held the mug like it contained answers. The woman who stood there now was not the same person who used to wait by the door with quiet hope. That version of Eleanor had long dissolved into the steam rising from countless morning kettles. The Eleanor that remained had grown silent not out of fear but calculation. She had spent months piecing together every deception Nathan planted, tracing every signature, following every whisper he left behind like breadcrumbs. And the deeper she dug, the more she realized just how thorough his betrayal had been. But rather than fall apart, she built a fortress. She started keeping duplicates of every document she could access. When Nathan left his laptop open, she didn't touch it, she photographed it. When she found a discarded receipt with unfamiliar addresses or phone numbers, she stored it with precision. Everything had its place now, organized, time-stamped, catalogued in a private folder on a cloud account Nathan didn't know existed. What he mistook for naivety was now her shield. She began rehearsing her responses in front of the mirror, her face stoic, voice steady. Not because she intended to confront him just yet, but because she knew the day would come when silence would no longer serve her, and when it did, her words had to be weapons. Maggie was her silent partner in the background, working with the discretion of someone who knew the stakes. They didn't meet often, but when they did, the updates were precise and disturbing. Several of the forged signatures on the property deeds matched a document Nathan once signed at their anniversary dinner. Eleanor had kept that napkin in a photo album for sentimental reasons. Now it was evidence. They had tracked transactions to a shell company registered under an alias linked to Sabrina. Even the email address used to authorize the transfers bore a variation of Nathan's childhood nickname. The web was tightening, and Nathan was still dancing in the middle of it, oblivious. Eleanor's strength didn't come from rage, it came from patience. She didn't want to destroy him impulsively. She wanted every move to be deliberate, legal, and irreversible. She didn't want revenge. She wanted control returned to her hands, piece by piece, until nothing of what Nathan had stolen could ever be reclaimed. Eleanor's days transformed into a quiet rhythm of strategic planning and emotional preservation. She still folded Nathan's clothes, but no longer out of love, out of camouflage. She kept her smiles small, her gestures predictable, so he wouldn't suspect the shift in energy. Every moment she spent in that house was a performance, but not one rooted in desperation. She had become the director of her own script, and Nathan, unknowingly, was just playing his part. She started observing him the way one might study a ticking clock, not in admiration but in anticipation. She noted his habits with the accuracy of a detective. When he lied, he blinked twice. When he was deflecting, he rubbed the base of his neck. When he was concocting something new, he became overly generous, bringing her wine, complimenting her dress, even suggesting a weekend trip. These gestures, which might have once softened her, now confirmed what she had always feared. Nathan's affection had always been a strategy. The man she had married had learned to mimic love, not give it, and Eleanor at long last had stopped trying to make sense of it. There was one particular evening that stood out, a night that painted itself on her memory with sharp brushstrokes. Nathan came home unusually early, wearing cologne he hadn't used in years, the kind she once bought him during their third anniversary. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and handed her a bouquet of lilies. The scent should have triggered something warm, but instead it brought nausea. She thanked him, placed the flowers in a vase, and asked nothing. As they sat through dinner, Nathan spoke animatedly about a new opportunity, a business venture he claimed would finally secure their financial freedom. He talked about buying property overseas, investing in long-term retirement packages, maybe even moving to a quieter town. Eleanor nodded, smiled, passed him the bread. But inside, her heart was thudding, not from fear but from clarity. Every word he spoke was another layer to the plan she had already begun to dismantle. After dinner, she excused herself and sat in the bathroom, not crying, not panicking, just staring at her reflection with a strange sense of power blooming in her chest. She realized she no longer needed him to confess. He already had in every forged document, every fabricated story, every kind lie. And when she returned to the table and met his eyes, she smiled, not the smile of a wife pleased by attention, but the smile of a woman who knew she held the ending to the story he thought he was writing alone. It had rained the night before, and the morning air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen petals. Willow Ridge was quiet as always, but Eleanor felt the shift beneath the silence. It wasn't a storm, not yet, but the clouds had begun to gather. Nathan moved through the house with a careless confidence, humming softly as he dressed for work. He paused at the mirror in their bedroom, adjusting his tie, oblivious to the storm he'd helped seed. Eleanor watched from the doorway, hidden in plain sight, her presence as unassuming as ever. But behind her calm eyes she was measuring every step. He reached for his phone, his second one, the one he thought she didn't know about, and slipped it into his coat pocket. She had already cloned it weeks ago. Every text to Sabrina, every call log, every email had been mirrored and stored. Still, she gave him a warm smile when he turned to kiss her goodbye, the same way she had every morning since they married, the same gesture. But today that kiss felt like punctuation, a period on the final sentence of a chapter he didn't know was ending. After Nathan left, Eleanor moved with purpose. She opened the box beneath the floorboards in the guest room, a space he rarely entered, and pulled out the folder she had kept hidden for months. It contained everything: forged documents, notarized affidavits from handwriting experts, bank statements showing irregular transfers, and screenshots of conversations between Nathan and Sabrina. Maggie had helped her prepare a legal timeline, complete with indexed references and witness confirmations. Every detail was cross-checked and chronologically laid out. But this wasn't just about legal proceedings anymore. It was about dismantling the illusion Nathan had so meticulously built. Eleanor had scheduled an appointment with a private mediator, a respected figure in town who handled estate disputes with the utmost discretion. Today, Nathan would be summoned under the guise of a financial review for their supposed joint investment, but instead, he would walk into a room where every lie he'd ever told had been laid bare. Eleanor dressed simply that morning, but she carried herself like someone wearing armor. No jewelry, no bright lipstick, just her natural face and steady hands clutching the folder. When she stepped outside, the breeze met her like a nod of approval. She didn't need courage anymore. She had certainty. Nathan arrived at the mediator's office with his usual swagger. His suit was pressed, his cologne sharp, his smile ready. He greeted the receptionist with a grin, joked about Willow Ridge traffic, and walked into the private room expecting a standard discussion about financial documents. But the moment he stepped inside and saw Eleanor seated beside the mediator, his expression faltered. Not dramatically, but enough for her to notice the twitch in his brow. She greeted him kindly, offered him a seat, and watched him sink into the leather chair across from her. Then she opened the folder. Page after page, she laid out the evidence, speaking softly, each word precise. She didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse, didn't flinch. She narrated as though reading aloud a story he'd forgotten he wrote. The forged signatures, the duplicate accounts, the shell companies, the fake investment forms, the missing assets, the property deed transferred without her knowledge, the emails between him and Sabrina strategizing how to portray her as mentally unwell. And as she spoke, Nathan said nothing. He didn't deny it, he didn't interrupt. He simply stared, each breath slower than the last. The mediator, a stern man with sharp eyes, didn't speak for the first 30 minutes. When he finally did, it was to confirm that the documentation met the standard for criminal inquiry. Eleanor didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or deliver dramatic declarations. She simply looked Nathan in the eye and told him that she had already filed an injunction to freeze all joint assets and that her attorney would be pursuing restitution through both civil and criminal channels. The weight of her words didn't need embellishment. They landed like stones on a still pond, rippling through the room. Nathan leaned back, suddenly unable to meet her gaze. He looked around the room as if searching for an exit that wasn't there. The mask he had worn for so long, the confident, charming husband, had cracked. Eleanor stood then, gathering the folder with the grace of someone who had nothing more to prove. As she turned to leave, she paused only once, placing a single envelope on the table before him. It contained copies of her official separation notice and the court-issued freeze order. She didn't wait for him to respond. She walked out into the daylight, not rushing, not hesitating, each step echoing with the kind of finality that required no words. The sun had broken through the clouds by then, casting a sharp light on the pavement ahead. And Eleanor walked into it, her shadow trailing behind her, but her path finally clear. The days that followed were unlike anything Nathan had ever known. For a man who once operated from a place of quiet confidence, who walked through Willow Ridge with the assurance of someone always in control, the sudden collapse of his reality felt like a foreign country. He stopped smiling as easily. His footsteps carried hesitation. At the local coffee shop, people he once greeted avoided his eyes. Conversations shifted as he entered rooms, and whispers trailed behind him like perfume. He had built a persona so polished that it reflected only what he wanted the world to see. And now that mask had been yanked away with surgical precision. Eleanor had not only exposed his deceit, but had done so with such composure, such poise, that it left him paralyzed in a way that loud accusations never could. Each evening he returned to a house that no longer felt like home. The silence within those walls, once his refuge, had turned against him. It mocked him. Every item Eleanor had touched now bore a kind of power he couldn't explain. Her absence became a presence, thick, deliberate, haunting. The legal fallout began slowly but gained momentum like a landslide. Eleanor's legal team was relentless yet professional. Bank accounts were frozen, assets reevaluated, and Nathan was summoned to mediation after mediation. He spent hours with his own attorneys, scrambling to justify actions he had long buried under lies. Sabrina, once so devoted, stopped answering his calls after the documents surfaced implicating her in the forged transfers. Her firm issued a statement denying knowledge, and she distanced herself entirely, leaving Nathan to bear the weight alone. Each attempt to reach her was met with silence or curt replies from her new lawyer. The isolation crept in slowly at first, but then it became suffocating. He started avoiding the places they once went together, stopped attending town meetings, cancelled plans with associates. People who once sought his advice now looked at him like a cautionary tale. And the worst part, Eleanor said nothing. Not publicly, not privately. She didn't drag his name through the mud. She didn't indulge in town gossip. Her silence was her verdict. She didn't need to shout her victory. She wore it like a well-tailored coat, and Nathan could feel its weight every time he turned a corner. For Eleanor, life didn't shift overnight, but there was an undeniable lightness to her days. She moved into a small but charming apartment downtown, the kind of place filled with windows and afternoon light. She began filling her home with things she chose for herself: soft linen curtains, mismatched mugs, art pieces from local vendors. She started walking every morning, sometimes with coffee in hand, other times just listening to the wind brush against the trees. Her routines changed. She no longer waited on anyone's schedule. She wrote more, not just in her journal, but for a local publication that found her reflections compelling. People began to recognize her not as Nathan Bailey's wife, but as Eleanor, the writer, the survivor, the woman who endured without breaking. Maggie remained a quiet presence beside her, both as a legal ally and a friend, and their bond deepened through shared meals, late-night calls, and small victories. Eleanor didn't talk much about what happened, but when she did, it wasn't with bitterness, it was with clarity. She had looked betrayal in the face and chosen not to carry it forward. She was rebuilding, not from rubble, but from conscious choice. And with each passing day, her world expanded beyond the boundaries Nathan once confined her to. One afternoon, weeks after the last mediation had closed, Nathan appeared outside her building. He looked older not just in features but in energy. His shoulders had lost their rigidity, his eyes dimmed. He stood by the entrance, unsure if he should knock or leave. When Eleanor emerged minutes later, keys in hand, their eyes met. For a moment, time suspended itself. He opened his mouth to speak, but she held up her hand, not in anger but in a gentle refusal. He looked down, reaching into his coat to pull out an envelope. "It's everything I have left," he whispered, offering it to her. She didn't reach for it. She simply looked at him and nodded once, then stepped aside to let herself into the building. No harsh words, no farewell. Just a closed door that no longer held any emotion. Nathan stood there for a moment longer before walking away, the envelope still in hand. That evening, Eleanor made herself a cup of tea, played her favorite record, and sat by the window. The world was quiet, but it was no longer heavy. And in that stillness she smiled, not for him, not for anyone, but for herself. It began quietly, like most transformations do, not with fanfare or public declaration, but in the stillness of Eleanor's solitude. Mornings took on a different rhythm, no longer dictated by another's schedule, but instead shaped by her own breath, her own desire to start again. The freedom was not loud. It didn't shout from the rooftops. It whispered through her choices, the way she folded her sheets without urgency, the time she took to prepare her meals with her favorite spices, the softness in how she now addressed herself in the mirror. There were no more anxious glances toward the door, no more pretending that silence was peace. Her silence now was full, intentional, and brimming with self-respect. Every inch of her new home spoke to her presence. The plants by the window thrived under her care. The books she once packed away in boxes now lined the shelves with stories she could get lost in again. Her phone rarely rang with unnecessary obligations, and when it did, it was from people who saw her, not her role, not her function, but her essence. Eleanor didn't measure her recovery in big achievements. She measured it in the way her laughter returned slowly, in the ease of her breath when she walked into familiar spaces, in how she no longer rehearsed what to say in her head before speaking her truth. One afternoon, she received a letter from a young woman named Camille, a reader of her recent essays. The letter was handwritten, filled with raw emotions, and described how reading Eleanor's words gave her the courage to leave a manipulative relationship. Camille's words were shaky but sincere, and they reached into Eleanor's heart with a force more profound than she expected. For years, Eleanor had lived in the shadow of someone else's narrative. She had walked the tightrope of survival in silence, but now her voice was echoing in places she had never imagined. The realization that her story had become a lifeline for someone else was both humbling and empowering. She wrote back to Camille, not with advice but with understanding. She shared pieces of her own recovery that hadn't made it into print, the nights she cried alone, the mornings she didn't feel strong, the moments she doubted herself even after leaving. And in that exchange something blossomed. Eleanor began receiving more letters, messages from women and even men who had felt unseen in their relationships, who had given too much of themselves for too little in return. She read every word not as praise but as testament to how deeply people needed to feel less alone. And for the first time, Eleanor saw that her pain had not been in vain. It had become a doorway, one she walked through slowly, carrying others with her. Meanwhile, Nathan's world continued its quiet collapse. The house that once felt like a symbol of his success was now just a building with echoes of everything he had lost. He moved through it like a visitor, no longer feeling ownership, just obligation. The calls had stopped. The meetings had dried up. His social circle, once wide and full of praise, had thinned into a handful of awkward sympathizers. He tried to rebuild, offering consulting services, reaching out to former clients, but his name no longer held the weight it once did. Some politely declined, others didn't respond at all. Sabrina had vanished from his life completely, returning his belongings through a courier service with a one-line note. This chapter is closed. Even his reflection felt unfamiliar. He had aged, not just in appearance but in spirit. The sharp lines of confidence that once framed his face had softened into something uncertain. He spent hours replaying conversations, searching for the moment things slipped, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had mistaken silence for submission. He had confused endurance with weakness. And now, the woman he once ignored had become the very force that unraveled him. Nathan wasn't destroyed in the way stories often paint villains to be. He wasn't behind bars or penniless, but he was exposed, stripped of the illusion that once protected him. Weeks turned into months, and the town of Willow Ridge continued as it always had, with its gentle routines and whispered gossip. Eleanor, now often seen at the local library or market, was greeted with genuine smiles. People who had once pitied her now admired her resilience. But she didn't bask in their approval. She didn't need it. Her life was no longer lived for validation. She spent her time writing, hosting small gatherings at her apartment, mentoring young women who were navigating similar struggles. Her world had expanded not with grandeur, but with meaning. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted her apartment in soft orange light, she sat by the window with a cup of tea in hand and reflected not on what she had endured, but on what she had reclaimed. She had loved and lost, had trusted and been betrayed, had broken and rebuilt. And now she lived with intention. Not in spite of what happened, but with full awareness of it. She didn't seek apologies. She didn't wish for a different ending. She had written her own, one where she was no longer at someone's mercy, but firmly in control of her peace, her purpose, and the path ahead. And as the evening turned to night, Eleanor closed her eyes not to escape, but to rest in a life she had finally made her own. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.